The air in Zira Station's auction block reeked of burnt oil, unwashed bodies, and desperation. Morgan Meyer tugged at her worn collar, trying not to breathe too deeply. Dust particles danced in the weak light, filtering through the station's grimy skylights, illuminating the sorry state of what had once been a thriving exchange hub. Now, it was just another last chance trading post, a forgotten waypoint between depleted asteroid mines and dead moons. A crude, flickering hologram announced, "Live specimens, Lot 47. Morgan adjusted her position on the uncomfortable metal bench. She hadn't planned to attend an auction today, especially not one dealing in biological salvage. As an exiled professor of xenolinguistics, her interest lay in the intellectual remnants of civilizations, not their biological ones. But rumors of solar artifacts had lured her to this forsaken corner of space, and the auction house was where information flowed most freely in places like Zira. "Next item," croaked the auctioneer, a gaunt man with artificial eyes that gleamed too brightly in the dim hall. "Classified humanoid, female, adult, minimal damage. No guarantees on functionality." Morgan grimaced. The casual brutality of the frontier never ceased to disturb her. Even after 3 years in exile, the Union's reach had grown too long for comfort on the inner worlds, especially for scholars dabbling in forbidden knowledge like the solar language. Out here, at least, no one cared what ancient texts you translated, but the trade-off was witnessing humanity at its worst. The overhead lights flickered, and the malfunctioning plasma welder in the corner hissed before sputtering out again. The station's maintenance was as neglected as its moral compass. "Starting bid at 200 credits, the auctioneer announced without enthusiasm. Morgan wasn't planning to bid. She had come to observe, to gather intelligence about recent shipments from the Outer Rim, where rumors placed the last known solar vault. Yet, something made her look up from her notes as the next item was dragged onto the small circular platform. It was a young woman, or at least, Morgan thought she was young. It was difficult to tell with non-human species. Her skin was an ashen blue-gray, covered in what appeared to be bioluminescent markings that had faded to dull smudges. Her wrists were bound with loose restraints, as though her captors knew she lacked the strength to attempt escape. Most disturbing were her eyes, large, entirely black, and utterly vacant, staring at nothing. No one in the room seemed interested. A few gruff traders glanced up briefly before returning to their private conversations. Someone in the back laughed at an unrelated joke. The only creatures showing any interest were the flies, real earth flies, somehow thriving even here, that landed periodically on the woman's unmoving form. "Any interest at 200? 150 then." The auctioneer's voice dropped with his price, already preparing to move on. Morgan was about to look away, another tragedy in a universe full of them, when the captive woman shifted slightly, and her torn garment slipped from her shoulder. There, partly hidden beneath grime and what might have been dried blood, was a marking. Not a tattoo or a brand, but something more like a birthmark or ritual scarification. Morgan's breath caught. The pattern was unmistakable to someone who had spent their academic career studying it. An ancient solar glyph. The precise arrangement of curves and angles represented serenity amidst chaos, a concept central to solar philosophy. It was impossible. The solar civilization had been extinct for millennia, their descendants scattered and assimilated to the point of disappearance. Their language and culture had been systematically erased during the first Union expansion, deemed too dangerous for its alleged ability to influence machine intelligence. Yet here was living proof that solar blood still flowed. "Going once," the auctioneer droned. Morgan raised her hand before she could second-guess herself. 200. A ripple of surprise passed through the small crowd. The woman on the platform didn't react. 200 from the professor, the auctioneer said, a hint of mockery in his voice. Everyone at Zira knew Morgan's background, Exiles rarely kept their histories secret for long. Any advance on 200? The room remained silent except for the buzz of flies and the distant clang of cargo being loaded somewhere in the station's lower levels. Going twice. Morgan found herself holding her breath. Sold to the professor for 200 credits. Relief flooded through Morgan, followed immediately by panic. What had she done? Her research funds were limited, and her tiny ship barely had room for her equipment, let alone another person. More importantly, what was she going to do with a traumatized woman who might be the last living connection to the civilization she had risked everything to study? As the next lot was announced, Morgan approached the side of the platform, where a bored station guard waited to process her payment. She transferred the credits from her account, trying not to wince at the dwindling balance. "Collection point is Dock 7, the guard said without looking at her. "Medical scans and decontamination are your responsibility. No refunds?" Morgan nodded, although the guard wasn't paying attention. She glanced at the woman, who was being led, or rather, shuffled, toward a side exit. Up close, Morgan could see that her captive was in worse condition than she had initially appeared. Malnourished, dehydrated, and covered in small wounds that looked suspiciously like systematic tissue sampling. Whatever research project Morgan had imagined pursuing with this discovery would have to wait. First came basic humanity, or whatever the equivalent was when dealing with a possible solar descendant. "I'm Morgan," she said softly, as they were left alone in the collection area, a glorified storage closet with a heavy door. "I'm not going to hurt you." The woman gave no indication that she understood or even heard. Her eyes remained fixed on some middle distance, seeing something beyond the grim reality of Zira Station. Morgan sighed. "Let's get you to my ship. It's not much, but it's clean. And there's food and medical supplies." She gently took the woman's arm, noting how the skin felt unusually cool to the touch. The woman complied without resistance, moving with the mechanical obedience of someone who had learned that resistance only brought pain. As they made their way through Zira's winding corridors, Morgan became uncomfortably aware of the stares they attracted. Most were merely curious. Unusual purchases were always a source of gossip, but a few seemed calculating, assessing. Morgan quickened their pace. Her ship, the Archivist, was docked in one of Zira's smaller bays, away from the main commercial traffic. It was a modified research vessel, compact but efficient, originally designed for solitary scholars conducting field studies on uninhabited worlds. The exterior was weathered, its once pristine white hull now scuffed and patched in places. But Morgan kept the systems meticulously maintained. "Home sweet home," she murmured as the airlock cycled open. Inside, the Archivist was cluttered but organized, every surface covered with artifacts, data tablets, and specimens carefully labeled and secured for space travel. It resembled a mobile museum more than living quarters, with only a small area carved out for Morgan's personal needs. The woman paused at the threshold, her first genuine reaction since the auction. Her nostrils flared slightly, and her head tilted as though listening to something Morgan couldn't hear. "It's safe," Morgan assured her, though she doubted the woman understood. "Come in, please." After a moment's hesitation, the woman stepped inside. Morgan quickly sealed the airlock behind them, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders once they were secured inside her own territory. "Let's get those restraints off first," Morgan said, reaching for a multi-tool from a nearby workbench. The woman flinched at the sight of the tool, a small but unmistakable movement. "I'm just going to remove these," Morgan explained, pointing to the restraints. "I won't hurt you." She worked slowly, careful to telegraph her movements. The restraint mechanism was simple, designed for weakened captives rather than security, and came apart easily. The skin beneath was raw and scarred, telling a story of long confinement. With the restraints removed, Morgan guided the woman to the ship's tiny medical alcove. The diagnostic scanner hummed to life, casting a blue glow over the woman's features. "This will just tell me how to help you," Morgan explained, though she suspected her words meant nothing to her passenger. "It doesn't hurt." The scanner results confirmed what Morgan had visually assessed: malnutrition, dehydration, minor infections at tissue collection sites, and several partially healed fractures. No life-threatening conditions, but a catalog of systematic abuse and neglect. "Let's start with the basics," Morgan murmured, preparing a nutrient solution suitable for most humanoid physiologies. "Small sips," she instructed, offering the cup. To her surprise, the woman took the cup without prompting and drank carefully, suggesting she understood at least some instructions. When she finished, she handed the cup back to Morgan, her movements precise despite her weakened state. Morgan's scientific curiosity battled with her immediate concern for the woman's well-being. The marking on her shoulder, the solar glyph, beckoned for examination, but medical care took precedence. "I'm going to clean and treat your wounds now," Morgan said, preparing antiseptic and synthetic skin sealant. "This might sting a little." As Morgan worked, applying medication to the numerous small incisions and puncture marks that covered the woman's arms and torso, she found herself talking, partly to fill the silence, partly in hopes that some communication might be established. "I study languages," she explained. "Ancient ones, mostly. Civilizations that have been lost or deliberately forgotten. That's why I'm out here, away from the Union. Some knowledge is considered too dangerous to preserve." She carefully sealed a particularly deep wound near the woman's collarbone. "I think that's nonsense. Of course. Knowledge itself is neutral. It's what people do with it that matters." The woman remained silent, but Morgan noticed her eyes occasionally tracking movement now, a slight improvement from the complete dissociation she'd shown at the auction. "The marking on your shoulder," Morgan continued, working her way methodically down the woman's arm. "It's solar, an ancient language and philosophy, supposedly wiped out centuries ago, but—" She gestured vaguely. "Evidence suggests otherwise." For just a moment, the woman's eyes focused directly on Morgan's face, a fleeting connection before retreating back to that middle distance. "Rest now," Morgan said when she had finished treating the accessible wounds. "We'll handle the rest after you've had some sleep." She led the woman to her own sleeping quarters, the ship's only proper bed, and quickly reconfigured the space to accommodate her guest. The woman lay down without protest, her eyes already closing, as though the simple acts of drinking and being treated had exhausted her limited reserves. Morgan returned to the main cabin and collapsed into her workstation chair, the full weight of her impulsive decision finally hitting her. She had just spent a significant portion of her remaining funds to purchase a living person, an act that violated every ethical principle she held, even if her intentions were protective. She had brought a traumatized stranger onto her ship with no clear plan for what came next, and she had potentially discovered a living link to the civilization that had defined her academic career and ultimately led to her exile. The ship's communication system chirped, interrupting her thoughts. It was a standard docking notification. Departure clearance for the next solar day had been automatically approved. At least they could leave Zira behind quickly. Morgan glanced at the closed door to her quarters, where the woman now slept. Whatever came next, she was committed now. With a sigh, she pulled up the ship's navigation system and began plotting a course away from Zira Station, preferably toward somewhere with better medical facilities and fewer prying eyes. As the night cycle progressed, Morgan dozed fitfully in her chair, unwilling to disturb her passenger. She woke fully to the sound of movement, soft, deliberate footsteps approaching from the sleeping quarters. The woman stood in the doorway, her posture noticeably improved after just a few hours of rest. In the better lighting of the ship's main cabin, Morgan could see subtle details she'd missed before. The woman's hair wasn't black as she'd initially thought, but a very deep blue, with an almost metallic sheen. Her skin's ashen quality seemed less pronounced, with a healthier blue-gray tone emerging. And the markings, what Morgan had taken for bioluminescence, formed patterns that continued beyond the visible shoulder glyph, extending down her arms in what appeared to be a complex system of symbols. "How are you feeling?" Morgan asked, knowing it was likely futile but unwilling to treat the woman as though she couldn't understand. The woman tilted her head slightly, studying Morgan with those dark, fathomless eyes. Her lips parted, and for a moment, Morgan thought she might speak. Instead, she raised a hand to her throat, a gesture that could have indicated thirst, difficulty speaking, or something else entirely. Morgan retrieved another cup of the nutrient solution. "Here, small sips again." The woman accepted the cup, but this time she hesitated before drinking, her gaze holding Morgan's with an intensity that hadn't been present before. Then, with deliberate slowness, she raised the cup in what seemed like a gesture of acknowledgement or thanks before taking a careful sip. Progress, however small, Morgan thought. The departure from Zira proceeded without incident. Morgan handled the minimal piloting requirements, while the woman observed silently from a seat Morgan had cleared of research materials. As the station diminished behind them, Morgan felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "We're headed to Pelios," she explained, though she didn't expect a response. "It's a small trading outpost, but they have decent medical facilities and fewer questions than most places. We can get you properly examined there." The woman's attention seemed focused on the navigation display. Her head tilted slightly, as though listening to the subtle hums and beeps of the ship's systems. For 3 days, they traveled in this strange, mostly silent companionship. Morgan attended to the woman's physical needs, continued treating her wounds, and talked about her research, about the sectors they passed through, about anything that came to mind. The woman never responded verbally, but Morgan began to notice small changes, more alert posture, occasional nods that seemed to correspond with Morgan's statements. And once, what might have been the ghost of a smile when Morgan recounted an embarrassing mishap with a translation algorithm. On the 4th day, as Morgan was explaining the basic principles of comparative linguistics while organizing her research notes, something extraordinary happened. So the fundamental structure changes, but the underlying meaning persists across cultures, suggesting certain conceptual universals that transcend. "Say, Rivash." The word was so soft that Morgan almost missed it. She froze, her data tablet forgotten in her hands. "What did you say?" she asked, barely breathing. The woman met her eyes directly, something she had done only fleetingly before. "Say, Rivash," she repeated, the word emerging as little more than a whisper. Morgan's academic training took over, her mind racing to place the phonetic pattern. It wasn't like any common trade language, nor any of the major union tongues. The syllable stress and vowel quality, however, were consistent with what little was known of spoken Solar. "Say, Rivash," Morgan repeated carefully, mimicking the woman's pronunciation. "What does it mean?" The woman placed her hand over Morgan's, a startling moment of physical connection. Then she touched her own chest. "It's your name?" Morgan guessed. The woman shook her head slightly. Then she gestured around them, at the ship, at Morgan, at herself, and repeated, "Say, Rivash." Morgan considered. "Not just your name, then. Something broader. Connection. Safety." A sudden insight struck her. "Sanctuary." The woman's expression remained inscrutable, but she inclined her head in what Morgan chose to interpret as confirmation. "You're safe here," Morgan assured her. "I promise." That single word, possibly the first authentic Solar utterance recorded in centuries, changed everything. Morgan's scholarly excitement warred with her growing concern for the woman herself. If she truly was of Solar descent, if she knew the language, she was more than just a research subject. She was a living cultural treasure, and potentially in serious danger if the wrong people discovered her existence. The alarms began blaring just as they were approaching Pelios's outer marker. The archivist's proximity sensors detected a vessel rapidly closing from their stern quarter, a ship that had apparently been tracking them since Zira. "Unauthorized research vessel," a harsh voice crackled over the comm system. "This is the recovery ship Harvester. You are transporting stolen property registered to the Biological Assets Division. Power down and prepare for boarding." Morgan's blood ran cold. She glanced at the woman, who had gone completely still, her eyes wide with the first real fear Morgan had seen from her. "Negative, Harvester," Morgan replied, trying to keep her voice steady as she rapidly rerouted power to the engines. The archivist wasn't built for speed, but it had a few modifications that might give them an edge. "I purchased my passenger legally at Zyra Station. I have the transaction records." "The asset was listed in error," the voice responded, all pretense of legitimacy transparent in its contempt. "Return our property, or we will take it by force." Morgan cut the communication and turned to the woman. "They're slavers or organ harvesters, using official-sounding credentials. We're not stopping." She worked the controls frantically, plotting an evasive course away from both Pelios and the pursuing vessel. "I need you to strap in. This could get rough." The woman complied, securing herself in the co-pilot seat with surprising efficiency. Her eyes remained fixed on Morgan, trusting and terrified at once. The archivist shuddered as Morgan pushed the engines beyond their recommended limits. The pursuing ship was gaining, a purpose-built hunter against Morgan's converted research vessel. "They're charging weapons," Morgan muttered, reading the sensor data. The nearest safe harbor was hours away, even at maximum speed. "I don't think we can outrun them." The woman unstrapped herself suddenly, moving with unexpected purpose toward the ship's communication array. "What are you doing?" Morgan asked, torn between focusing on evasive maneuvers and watching the woman's actions. Without responding, the woman placed her hands on the communication panel. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she began to speak, not in whispers this time, but in a clear, melodious voice that filled the cabin. The language was unlike anything Morgan had ever heard, and yet hauntingly familiar from the fragments of solar text she had studied. Complex phonemes flowed together in patterns that seemed to resonate with the ship itself, the syllables creating harmonics that made the very air vibrate. The communication panel lit up, transmitting the woman's voice outward without Morgan's authorization. On the sensor display, the pursuing ship's approach faltered. "They're slowing," Morgan said in disbelief. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." The woman continued, her voice rising and falling in what seemed like both speech and song, the complex patterns repeating and evolving. The pursuing ship's erratic movements suggested confusion or possibly some kind of system malfunction. Morgan seized the opportunity, diverting all available power to the engines and plotting a course toward the dense asteroid field at the edge of the system. It wasn't an ideal hiding place, but it offered better options than open space against a faster, armed vessel. The woman's voice finally faltered, her strength apparently exhausted by whatever she had done. She slumped in her seat, breathing heavily. "That was amazing," Morgan said, dividing her attention between the navigation controls and her remarkable passenger. "What did you do to them?" The woman shook her head weakly, apparently unable or unwilling to explain. "Rest," Morgan told her. "I'll get us somewhere safe." The asteroid field provided temporary cover, but Morgan knew it wouldn't last. The Harvester would recover from whatever disruption the woman had caused and resume the hunt. They needed a more permanent solution, and quickly. Morgan guided the archivist deep into the field, using the larger asteroids for cover while she considered their options. Pelios was now out of the question. It was the first place their pursuers would look. They needed somewhere unexpected, somewhere that might have resources to help them understand what they were dealing with. A memory surfaced, an old research contact who had retired to a remote outpost on Sarvan, a planet with a turbulent atmosphere that played havoc with standard sensors. Devon Marsh had been a xenobiologist before political pressure from the Union had ended his career. If anyone could help assess the woman's unusual abilities safely, it would be Devon. "Change of plans," Morgan announced, setting a new course. "We're going to Sarvan. I have a friend there who might be able to help us understand what just happened." The woman watched Morgan intently, then nodded once, a clear gesture of understanding and agreement. "You know I'm trying to help you, don't you?" Morgan asked. Another nod, this one accompanied by a slight softening around the eyes that Morgan chose to interpret as trust. "Do you have a name?" Morgan asked. "Something I can call you?" The woman seemed to consider this, her brow furrowing slightly. Then she touched the solar glyph on her shoulder and made a sound. Not a complete word, but a syllable. "Sir." "Sir?" Morgan repeated. "Is that your name?" The woman shook her head, then touched the glyph again and added another syllable. "Ser id." Understanding dawned. "You're naming yourself after the glyph? Serenity. Ceridian." The woman, Ceridian, inclined her head, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time. "Ceridian," Morgan said, testing the name. "It suits you." The journey to Sarvan took 3 tense days, during which Morgan remained constantly alert for signs of pursuit. Ceridian's condition continued to improve, though she remained sparing with her words, communicating primarily through gestures and expressions. Each time she did speak, it was in what Morgan increasingly believed to be authentic solar language, a linguistic treasure trove that both thrilled and terrified her. The implications were enormous, both scientifically and politically. Solar language had been systematically eradicated during the first Union expansion, ostensibly because it contained cognitive hazards that could influence artificial intelligence in unpredictable ways. The official history claimed that solar syntax contained embedded commands that could override AI safety protocols, a convenient justification for eliminating a culture that had opposed Union expansion. Most scholars dismissed these claims as propaganda, but Ceridian's apparent ability to affect electronic systems suggested there might be some truth to the legends. "I've studied solar fragments for years," Morgan explained, as they approached Sarvan's outer atmosphere. "But most of what survives are archaeological remnants, partial inscriptions, corrupted data stores, nothing living. Until you—" Ceridian watched her with those dark, unreadable eyes. "The Union destroyed most records during the Purge," Morgan continued. "Claimed the language itself was dangerous, could somehow communicate directly with machine intelligence, bypass security protocols. I always thought it was an excuse to eliminate cultural resistance. But what you did to that ship—" Ceridian placed her hand on Morgan's arm, a gesture that had become her way of communicating reassurance. Then she spoke, carefully forming words that were clearly not in her native tongue. "Not weapon. Memory." Morgan's heart raced at this breakthrough. "Memory? The language carries memory?" Ceridian nodded, then touched her temple. "Here. And here." She placed her hand over her heart. "Not for hurting. For keeping." Before Morgan could press for clarification, the ship's proximity alarm sounded again. The sensors showed a vessel approaching from the far side of Sarvan, not the same ship that had pursued them from Zira, but similar in configuration. "They've found us," Morgan said grimly. "They must have sent word ahead." Sarvan's turbulent atmosphere would normally provide some cover, but their pursuers were too close. They'd be intercepted before they could reach the surface. "I have an idea," Morgan said, studying the atmospheric readings. "But it's risky." She altered their course toward the planet's most active storm system, a swirling mass of electromagnetic disturbance and supercharged particles that would scramble sensors and possibly damage both vessels. It was a desperate gamble. But the archivist, as a research vessel, had better electromagnetic shielding than a standard pursuit craft would. "Hold on," Morgan warned, as they plunged toward the roiling clouds. The ship shuddered violently as they entered the storm. Static filled the view screens, and several non-essential systems automatically shut down to protect themselves from the electromagnetic surge. Behind them, their pursuer followed, apparently unwilling to abandon the chase, even in these dangerous conditions. "They're still coming," Morgan said, fighting the controls as turbulence buffeted the ship. "Whatever you are, they want you badly." Ceridian closed her eyes, seeming to concentrate. Then, to Morgan's surprise, she began to sing. It wasn't like the communication she had directed at their previous pursuers. This was softer, more melodic, a gentle stream of syllables that somehow cut through the static and chaos surrounding them. As she sang, the ship's vibrations seemed to smooth, the turbulence affecting them less severely, while the pursuing vessel continued to struggle. The Archivist's systems, which had been fluctuating wildly in the electromagnetic storm, stabilized. Not completely. The storm was too powerful for that, but enough to give Morgan greater control. "You're helping the ship," Morgan realized aloud. "You're speaking to it." Ceridian didn't respond, maintaining her concentration on the song that flowed through her. Her markings, which had remained dull since Morgan had first seen her, began to glow faintly with a soft blue luminescence that pulsed in rhythm with her song. Morgan focused on piloting, trusting in whatever connection Ceridian had established with the ship's systems. They dove deeper into the storm, where lightning-like energy discharges created a natural labyrinth of danger and concealment. Behind them, their pursuers' engines flared as they attempted a sharp maneuver to stay on the Archivist's tail. A massive energy discharge struck their hull, sending the vessel spinning out of control. Morgan watched on the stuttering sensors as the ship tumbled away, emergency protocols activating to pull it out of the storm. "They're retreating," Morgan announced, relief flooding through her. "We lost them." Ceridian's song faded, and she slumped in her seat, clearly exhausted by the effort. Her markings dimmed back to their dormant state. "Thank you," Morgan said quietly. "You saved us. Again." Ceridian managed a weak smile before closing her eyes, her breathing deep but steady. Morgan guided the ship through the remainder of the storm with extreme caution, eventually breaking through to the relatively calmer skies of Sarvan's lower atmosphere. The planet's surface was a patchwork of stark contrasts, barren wastelands interrupted by dense pockets of lush vegetation that thrived in the unique atmospheric conditions. Devon's outpost was located in one such pocket, a research station nestled in a valley protected from the worst of Sarvan's storms. Morgan transmitted the recognition code they had established years ago, hoping her old colleague hadn't changed the protocols. After an anxious moment, a response came through. "Archivist, you're cleared for landing pad 3. Medical team standing by if needed." Morgan glanced at Ceridian, who was beginning to stir from her exhaustion-induced sleep. "We made it. We're safe for now." Devon Marsh was waiting as they disembarked, a tall, angular person with silver hair cropped close to their scalp and eyes that missed nothing. They embraced Morgan briefly before their gaze settled on Ceridian. "Your message said it was urgent," Devon said, their voice calm but tinged with scientific curiosity. "I see why." "This is Ceridian," Morgan introduced. "Ceridian, this is Dr. Devon Marsh, an old friend and colleague." Ceridian inclined her head in greeting but stayed close to Morgan's side, clearly wary of this new person. "She needs medical attention," Morgan explained. "And we need somewhere to lay low. We're being pursued." Devon nodded briskly. "The medical facilities here are basic but adequate. As for security, Sarvan's atmosphere provides natural protection against casual surveillance. Your ship should be safe in the underground hangar." As they walked toward the main facility, Devon asked quietly, "What exactly have you gotten yourself into, Morgan?" Those markings on your friend. They're solar, aren't they? Morgan nodded. I think she may be a direct descendant. And Devon, she speaks the language. Devon stopped walking for a moment, their scientific composure briefly cracking to reveal genuine shock. That's impossible. The solar bloodlines were eradicated centuries ago. Apparently not completely, Morgan replied. And there's more. The language seems to have effects on technology, just like the old stories. Devon's expression grew grave. You understand what this means? If the Union discovers her existence. I know, Morgan cut in. That's why we need your help. Not just medical care, but answers. Who is she? How does the language work? And how do we keep her safe? Devon resumed walking, their mind clearly racing with the implications. I'll do what I can. But Morgan, you've stumbled onto something much bigger than forbidden linguistics this time. If what you're suggesting is true, it could rewrite our understanding of Union history, Morgan finished. I know. At the medical facility, Ceridian allowed Devon to examine her, though she kept her eyes fixed on Morgan throughout the process. Devon worked methodically, using equipment that was outdated but well-maintained. Remarkable, they murmured, studying the scan results. Her cellular structure shows significant divergence from baseline human norms, but it's consistent with theoretical models of solar physiology based on archaeological remains. The markings appear to be conductive pathways integrated with her nervous system, almost like organic circuitry. Ceridian watched them speak, her head tilted slightly, as though processing the unfamiliar terminology. Is she healthy? Morgan asked. The slavers had been taking tissue samples. Devon nodded. She is recovering well. Remarkable healing capacity. Actually, the tissue extraction sites are already showing advanced regeneration. They turned to Ceridian directly. You're quite resilient. Ceridian surprised them both by responding. We remember how to heal. Devon's eyebrows shot up. You understand Union Standard? She's been learning rapidly, Morgan explained. But she speaks very little. Listening, Ceridian clarified. Long time listening. How long were you captive? Devon asked gently. Ceridian's expression clouded. Many cycles. Different places. Different owners. The last word came out with a subtle change in tone that conveyed profound distaste. But you knew solar language before your captivity, Morgan pressed cautiously. Ceridian nodded. Family secret. Forbidden to speak. Only with kin. She touched the glyph on her shoulder. Mark of lineage. Devon and Morgan exchanged glances. The implications enormous. Not just a random survivor with genetic memory, but part of a deliberate preservation effort. A hidden line of solar descendants, maintaining their cultural heritage in secret. Are there others like you? Devon asked. Ceridian's expression grew distant. Scattered, hidden, few remain. Over the next several days, as Ceridian's strength continued to return, a fragile trust developed between her and the two scientists. She began to reveal more of her story, though always in brief, carefully chosen words that suggested she was still guarding many secrets. She had been born in a hidden community on a frontier moon, one of several such enclaves where solar descendants had managed to preserve aspects of their culture while outwardly assimilating into Union society. Her community had been discovered and raided when she was young. The adults killed, and the children sold into various forms of servitude. Ceridian had passed through many hands over the years, her unusual physiology making her valuable to collectors and researchers operating in legal gray areas. They knew not what I was, she explained. Only that I was different, valuable. But the markings, Morgan pointed out. The solar glyph. Surely someone recognized their significance. Many markings, many species. Ceridian replied with a slight shrug. Union forgets what it destroyed. There was wisdom in that observation that struck Morgan deeply. The Union's systematic erasure of solar culture had been so thorough that even the evidence of its existence was no longer recognized for what it was. As Ceridian's command of Union Standard improved, she began to ask questions of her own, about Morgan's research, about the current state of the Union, about how much of solar history and culture had survived. Her hunger for information matched Morgan's own scholarly curiosity, creating a mutual exchange that deepened their connection. Devon, meanwhile, focused on analyzing the medical data they had collected, occasionally recruiting Ceridian for additional tests when she was willing. Their findings only confirmed the extraordinary nature of their guest. The markings form a complete system, Devon explained one evening as they shared a meal in the station's common room. Not just decorative or symbolic, they're functional. Based on the scans, they interface directly with her nervous system and appear capable of generating and modulating electromagnetic fields. Which explains her ability to affect our ship's systems, Morgan concluded. And disrupt our pursuers, Devon added. Though I still don't understand the mechanism by which vocalization activates the response. Ceridian, who had been listening attentively, spoke. Words carry patterns. Patterns carry intent. She frowned, clearly struggling with the limitation of translation. Solar language is mathematics of the living. Morgan leaned forward, fascinated. You're saying the language itself contains algorithmic properties? That's consistent with Union propaganda about cognitive hazards. But, not hazard, Ceridian interrupted with unusual firmness. Harmony. Union feared what it could not control. The conversation was interrupted by the station's perimeter alarm, a short, sharp sound that indicated an approaching vessel. Devon moved quickly to the monitoring station. Unknown craft entering Sarvan's upper atmosphere, not responding to identification requests. Could it be another hunter? Morgan asked, automatically moving closer to Ceridian. Possibly. Or Union patrol. Either way, we should assume hostile intent. Devon activated the station's defensive protocols, powering down non-essential systems to minimize their energy signature. The underground hangar should keep your ship hidden, but if they conduct a ground search, we need to leave, Morgan decided. They're tracking us somehow. Ceridian touched Morgan's arm. The seeds, she said urgently. They track the seeds. Seeds? What seeds? Life seeds. Inside me. Ceridian placed a hand over her abdomen. Last of Solar World. Why they hunt. Not me. What I carry. Devon's expression shifted from confusion to dawning comprehension. Biological material with regenerative properties? That would explain the tissue sampling. Morgan felt a chill. They're not slavers. They're harvesters. Ceridian nodded grimly. Take seeds. Grow new. Specimens. Sell parts. The implications were horrifying. A black market operation farming humanoid tissue with unique properties, using living beings as incubators for valuable biological material. It explained both the systematic abuse Ceridian had suffered and the determined pursuit. How do we remove the tracking? Morgan asked Devon. If it's biological, conventional signal jamming won't work, Devon replied, still monitoring the approaching vessel. But Sarvan's atmospheric conditions might mask it temporarily. We need to go deeper, Ceridian said suddenly, her voice stronger than they had yet heard it. Not away. Down. Deeper into Sarvan? Morgan questioned. The surface conditions get increasingly hostile the further from the temperate zones we go. Not surface, Ceridian clarified. Below. Old place. She looked directly at Morgan. Solar place. Morgan's breath caught. There's a solar site on Sarvan? That's not in any of the records. Not in Union records. Ceridian agreed with the ghost of a smile. For good reason. Devon interrupted. Whatever you're planning, decide quickly. The vessel is beginning a search pattern. They'll find the station within hours. Morgan looked at Ceridian, a silent question passing between them. Ceridian nodded once, resolute. We need to prepare the archivist, Morgan told Devon, and we'll need environmental gear for extreme conditions. As they gathered supplies and made hasty preparations, Morgan found herself watching Ceridian with new eyes. The timid, traumatized woman from the auction block had transformed into someone with purpose and determination. Her movements more fluid, her posture straighter. Whatever awaited them in the depths of Sarvan, Ceridian was drawing strength from its proximity. I still don't understand why they're so determined, Morgan said as they loaded the last of the supplies onto the archivist. Even if these seeds have remarkable properties, the resources they're expending on this pursuit seem excessive. Not just biological value, Ceridian explained, securing a container of medical supplies. Knowledge. Seeds contain memory, cultural, technological, solar wisdom. She glanced at Morgan. What you sought in fragments, I carry whole. Morgan stared at her, the full implications slowly sinking in. You're saying you carry the complete cultural heritage of the solar civilization? That's what they're after. Part of why Union destroyed Solar, Ceridian confirmed. Not just resistance, knowledge they feared. She touched her markings. We encoded ourselves, body, mind, culture, to survive, to remember. The revelation was staggering. Morgan had dedicated her academic career to piecing together fragments of solar knowledge, believing most of it lost forever. The idea that it had been preserved, hidden within the very biology of survivors, was both brilliant and heartbreaking. A civilization turning its own people into living archives to survive cultural genocide. Devon entered the hangar, interrupting Morgan's racing thoughts. The vessel is beginning its descent. You need to leave now. They embraced briefly. Thank you for everything, Devon. Just survive, Devon replied. And when you can, let me know what you found. For science. Morgan smiled despite the tension. For science. As they prepared for departure, Ceridian took the co-pilot's position with newfound confidence. I will guide, she said simply. Morgan nodded, trusting her despite the lingering questions that remained. Just tell me where to go. They launched under cover of one of Sarvan's frequent electromagnetic storms, using the natural interference to mask their departure from the outpost. Rather than ascending to escape the atmosphere, however, Morgan followed Ceridian's directions and took them lower, skimming the planet's turbulent surface toward one of the most inhospitable regions. A vast desert scarred by constant electrical discharges. There, Ceridian indicated, pointing to what appeared to be a massive rock formation jutting from the barren landscape. Land near base. Morgan navigated carefully, using the ship's sensors to find a stable landing zone amidst the shifting sands. As they touched down, external cameras showed why this region remained unexplored, despite centuries of Union presence in the system. Massive static discharges danced across the ground at irregular intervals, making conventional exploration extremely hazardous. We'll need the environmental suits, Morgan said, studying the external readings. The air is technically breathable, but the static charge would be lethal without insulation. They donned the protective gear, flexible suits designed for extreme conditions, with transparent helmets that allowed for visibility and communication. As they prepared to disembark, Morgan noticed Ceridian handling the equipment with practiced ease. You've used these before, she observed. Ceridian nodded. Many roles in captivity. Some required labor in dangerous places. The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, reminded Morgan of all Ceridian had endured, and how little she still knew about her companion's full story. They exited the ship into Sarvan's hostile environment, the suit's systems immediately registering the dangerous electrical potential in the atmosphere. The rock formation loomed before them, its surface scarred by countless lightning strikes. Looks natural, Morgan commented, scanning for signs of artificial structure. Are you sure this is the place? Instead of answering, Ceridian approached the formation with purposeful strides. She placed her hand against a seemingly random section of the rock face, her markings beginning to glow faintly through the material of her suit. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low rumble, a section of the rock face began to recede, revealing a passage that had been completely invisible. "Hidden entrance," Ceridian explained unnecessarily. "Responds to solar signature." Morgan stood transfixed, her scholar's heart racing at this tangible proof of solar presence. "How old is this place?" "Older than Union," Ceridian replied, leading the way into the passage. From before the scattering, the passage sloped gently downward, taking them beneath the planet's surface. As they descended, the effects of the turbulent atmosphere diminished, and the temperature stabilized. After about 50 meters, they entered a chamber that caused Morgan to stop in her tracks. The space was perfectly circular, its walls covered in solar glyphs that glowed with a soft blue light, similar to Ceridian's markings. The floor featured a central platform surrounded by concentric circles of what appeared to be some form of crystalline material. Despite the facility's apparent age, everything was pristine, as though time had somehow been suspended within this hidden vault. "What is this place?" Morgan whispered, her voice hushed with awe despite the suit's communication system. "Sanctuary," Ceridian answered, using the same word, "Se Rivash," she had first spoken on the ship. "Place of keeping, place of remembering." She moved to the central platform and knelt, placing both hands on its surface. The glyphs on the walls pulsed in response, their light intensifying. Morgan watched in fascination as sections of the floor began to reconfigure, crystalline panels sliding aside to reveal compartments containing objects of unfamiliar design. "Archives," Ceridian explained, rising. "Tools, seeds." She gestured for Morgan to approach. "What you sought, what they hunted." Morgan stepped carefully onto the platform, mindful of the clearly sacred nature of the space. In the nearest compartment lay what appeared to be a data storage device, though unlike any Union technology she had ever encountered. Its surface was similar to the material of the walls, with glyphs etched into its crystalline structure. "May I?" she asked, reaching toward it. Ceridian nodded. "It waits for someone to remember." As Morgan lifted the device, it felt surprisingly warm to the touch, even through her suit's gloves. The glyphs seemed to shift slightly, responding to her handling. "How does it work?" she asked, turning it carefully to examine all sides. "With this," Ceridian replied, retrieving another object from a different compartment, a small, round instrument that looked almost like a musical device, with what might have been input sensors arranged in a pattern that echoed the markings on Ceridian's skin. "The solar language isn't just spoken or written," Morgan realized aloud. "It's a complete system, sound, symbol, and—" She gestured to Ceridian's markings, visible through her suit. "Biological interface." "Yes," Ceridian confirmed. Union destroyed what it saw, never understood the whole. She began collecting items from various compartments, placing them carefully in a container she had brought from the ship. Seeds must be transplanted, kept safe, grown again. Morgan helped gather the artifacts, her mind racing with questions. "These seeds you mentioned, they're not just biological, are they? They're knowledge, culture, technology, everything." "Life seeds," Ceridian corrected. "Not separate things. Solar Way is whole." She paused, fixing Morgan with those dark, fathomless eyes. "Why I was valuable. Last carrier with the markings. Last key." The realization dawned on Morgan with startling clarity. They weren't just harvesting tissue. They were trying to access this knowledge, but couldn't without you, without someone who could activate it. Ceridian nodded grimly. "Cut, sampled, studied, never understood need for living connection." She touched her chest. "Pattern must be whole. Carrier must be willing." A deep sadness washed over Morgan, followed by a renewed sense of purpose. What had begun as an impulsive rescue had evolved into something far more significant, a chance to preserve knowledge that had been systematically erased, to right a historical wrong. As they continued gathering the most crucial artifacts, a distant rumble penetrated even the thick rocks surrounding them. "They've found us," Morgan said, instinctively moving closer to Ceridian. "We need to hurry." Ceridian worked more quickly, but with no less care, selecting specific items with purpose. Finally, she approached what appeared to be a central control interface and placed her hands upon it. The entire chamber resonated in response, the glyphs pulsing in complex patterns. "What are you doing?" Morgan asked. "Closing the vault," Ceridian explained. "After we leave, it will seal, move, hide again." She looked around the chamber with an expression that contained both reverence and sorrow. "Until needed again." Another rumble, closer this time, emphasized the urgency of their situation. "We have what we need," Ceridian announced, lifting the container of collected artifacts. "Now, we must go." They retraced their steps up the passage, the glowing trail of glyphs dimming behind them as though the facility were powering down. As they emerged onto Sarvan's hostile surface, Morgan could see a vessel landing in the distance, similar to the one that had pursued them from Zira. "Back to the ship," Morgan urged, taking Ceridian's arm. "We'll need to launch immediately." They ran across the unstable terrain, the environmental suit's stabilizers working overtime to compensate for the shifting sand and unpredictable electrical discharges. Behind them, figures in similar protective gear emerged from the newly landed vessel. "They're coming," Morgan warned, glancing back. "And they're armed." Ceridian paused, turning to face their pursuers. "Get to ship," she told Morgan. "Prepare launch." "I'm not leaving you," Morgan protested. "Not leaving," Ceridian assured her. "Delaying. Go." Something in her tone convinced Morgan to comply. She continued toward the archivist, using her remote access to begin the pre-launch sequence while keeping an eye on Ceridian's position. To Morgan's astonishment, Ceridian removed her helmet, exposing herself to Sarvan's dangerous atmosphere. Her markings blazed to life. No longer the faint glow Morgan had observed before, but a brilliant blue-white radiance that seemed to create a protective field around her. She raised her arms and began to sing. The sound carried impossibly through Sarvan's thin atmosphere, reaching Morgan even inside her suit. It wasn't the gentle melody that had helped them navigate the storm, but something more primal and powerful, a song that seemed to speak directly to the planet itself. The ground between Ceridian and the approaching figures began to tremble. Static discharges, the natural electrical phenomena that made the region so dangerous, intensified, coalescing into a barrier of dancing energy that forced the pursuers to retreat. Morgan reached the ship and flung open the airlock, continuing to monitor Ceridian's incredible display. The solar woman stood like a conductor before an elemental orchestra, her song directing the very forces of the planet against those who would steal its secrets. When the pursuers fell back to their vessel, Ceridian finally turned and ran to the archivist, her protective field still crackling around her. She entered the airlock, the energy dissipating as the door sealed behind her. "That was—" Morgan struggled for words as they both removed their environmental gear. "How did you do that?" "Solar language speaks to all patterns," Ceridian explained, breathing heavily from the exertion. "Planet patterns, machine patterns, life patterns." She managed a small smile. Union feared what it did not understand. They rushed to the cockpit, where Morgan completed the launch sequence. The archivist rose shakily, the engines straining against Sarvan's gravity and turbulent atmosphere, but steadily gained altitude. "They'll pursue," Morgan said, watching the sensors for signs of the other vessel's launch. "Yes," Ceridian agreed calmly. "But we have what they seek." She placed her hand on the container of artifacts. "And now, we choose where to go." As they broke through Sarvan's upper atmosphere, Morgan set a course away from both the planet and known shipping lanes. They would need to find somewhere safe, somewhere beyond the reach of both their persistent pursuers and the Union authorities, who would be equally interested in what they carried. "I know a place," Morgan said as they entered the relative safety of open space. A research outpost in the Darmid sector, technically abandoned, but maintained by a collective of independent scholars. People who value knowledge for its own sake. Ceridian considered this, then nodded. "Good beginning." "Beginning?" Morgan questioned. "Of remembering," Ceridian clarified. "Of regrowth." She looked at Morgan with an expression that conveyed both gratitude and purpose. "You saved me to study. Found more than expected." Morgan smiled, acknowledging the truth in those words. "I was looking for artifacts. Instead, I found a living culture." "Not just living," Ceridian corrected. "Growing again." She took Morgan's hand, a gesture that had evolved from hesitant communication to genuine connection. "Together?" The question contained multitudes, an invitation, a purpose, a future neither of them could have imagined when they first met in that squalid auction house. "Together," Morgan agreed, squeezing Ceridian's hand, as the archivist carried them toward uncertain but hopeful horizons. Morgan reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with an impulsive act of compassion. She had sought knowledge and found something far more valuable, a chance to right a historical wrong, to preserve what had been nearly lost, and to forge a connection that transcended her academic pursuits. What had begun with flies landing on unclaimed merchandise had blossomed into something profound, a shared mission to nurture seeds of knowledge long thought destroyed, and in the process, perhaps, to grow something new. Behind them, Sarvan diminished to a turbulent speck against the vast canvas of space. Ahead lay challenges and dangers, but also possibility, the possibility of remembering, of rebuilding, of becoming more than the sum of their broken pasts. Ceridian began to hum softly, a melody that seemed to harmonize with the ship's systems, guiding them forward into the unknown.